This morning, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Professor John Swinton, who will be our first keynote speaker. He is professor in practical theology and pastoral care and chair in divinity and religious studies at the University of Aberdeen. For more than a decade, he worked as a registered mental health nurse. He also worked for a number of years as a hospital and community mental health chaplain, alongside of people with severe mental health challenges who were moving from the hospital into the community. In 2004, he founded the University of Aberdeen's Center for Spirituality, Health and Disability. He has published widely within the area of mental health, dementia, disability theology, spirituality, and healthcare, qualitative research, and pastoral care. He is the author of a number of monographs, including Becoming Friends of Time, Disability, Timefulness, and Gentle Discipleship, published by Baylor Press in 2017. His book, Finding Jesus in the Storm, The Spiritual Lives of People with Mental Health Challenges, published by Eerdmans in 2020, won the 2022 Aldersgate Book Prize. And his book, Dementia, Living in the Memories of God, also by Eerdmans in 2012, was awarded the Archbishop of Canterbury's Ramsay Prize for Theological Excellence. John is married with 5 children. He is also a musician and a songwriter. And so at this point, I will turn it over to you, John. Welcome.
Morning, Frank, or afternoon as it is here. First of all, it's a real pleasure to be able to spend some time with everybody and to help to discuss some issues that I hope will be both interesting and stimulating. My job, I think, is to kind of lay some foundations for the kind of things that we're going to be talking about over the next couple of days. And so what I chose to do was to take these two terms, spirituality and disability, and begin to think, what do we mean when we talk about spirituality? And how does that impact upon how we think about disability? So that's the plan. So I want to begin by thinking, how do we come to know the world? Well, we come to know the world by describing the world. And our descriptions determine what we think we see. There's a huge difference between describing somebody who has schizophrenia as a schizophrenic, as opposed to as someone who's living with a mental health challenge. So these descriptions actually shape and form what we think we see. And what we think we see is how we respond. So what we believe about the world will determine how we look at it. How we look at the world will determine how we name it. And how we name something in the world will determine how we respond to it. So our descriptions are really, really important. So I want us to think today about 2 types of description. There's not a very interesting and well-known anthropologist called Clifford Geertz, who's an ethnographer. So he looks at situations, looks at cultures, and tries to describe them. And he talks about 2 different types of description. One being a thick description, the other being a thin description. So a thick description, let's begin with a thin description. A thin description really is the bare bones of what we're talking about. So he talks about the idea of a wink. So when you wink, at one level, it's just the movement of muscles, it's this movement of closing that eye. But at a deeper level, it has multiple meanings. It can be mischievous, it can be devious, it can be offensive. So that simple act of winking in a thin description is just moving the muscles. A thicker description takes it into your emotional concept, your relational concept, what it means to the people around you. Thick descriptions do that. Thick descriptions take these thin descriptions, which may be accurate, and they build meaning into them. They build relationships onto them. They build community onto them. And so you have a big description. And when you have a big, thick description, then you begin to see things quite differently. So I want us to think about thick descriptions. So spirituality and disability, I want to suggest to you, are thick concepts that are often presented as thin ideas. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's think about spirituality. When you look at the literature around spirituality, you'll find there's as many definitions as there are people writing about it. And what people tend to do is they create or make up a definition, and then they go looking for the symptoms or signs, rather, of that definition in the things that they research. So there's a tension, a problem within the way we think about spirituality. But I want to think about just basically, spirituality tries to answer 4 basic questions. Who am I? Where do I come from? Where am I going to? And why? Now, all of these questions are the questions that all religions, to a greater or lesser extent, try to answer. Who am I? Where do I come from? Where am I going to? Why? In a kind of post-religious context, people seek after meaning and ways of answering these questions in different ways. But let's think about these 4 questions as a point of orientation to how we're going to understand spirituality. Now, one of the problems or challenges, depending on how you want to frame it, with many definitions of spirituality is that they're really thin. If you look at the healthcare literature, for example, most definitions of spirituality do seek to answer these 4 questions in different ways, but they run something like this. Spirituality is a search for meaning, purpose, value, dignity, love, hope, and for some people, God. Now, at one level, that's okay because spirituality kind of does do that. But when you begin to break it down, what do people mean by each of these dimensions? And what you'll find people tend to mean is individual spirituality. So it's my meaning, my purpose, my value, my dignity, my choice as to whether or not I include God in that overall spiritual structure. So the understanding of spirituality we often see mirrors very closely our ideas of individualism within Western society. It's my spirituality. Now, I want to suggest to you that's quite a thin description of spirituality that has 1 or 2 difficulties. For example, in healthcare, that kind of spirituality is quite prevalent. But the way that it runs is like this. Within healthcare systems, there's not really any room for particularity because we all, in different ways, have to find a way of communicating that appeals to everybody. And so people will talk about healthcare spirituality as being for all faiths and none. And that's fine because that's the way the system is. But what you find you develop there is an understanding of spirituality that's shaped and formed by the institution. So it's an institutional spirituality in that sense. There's parameters that are laid down by the intention of the institution. And so you get a thin definition of spirituality. It functions well, pragmatically it's fine, but actually it's quite thin. It's individualized, it doesn't like particularity, it simply wants to work in generalization. In the same way as you can't have an antibiotic that works for one person, you have to have a spirituality that works for everybody. So spirituality, you can see, is complicated, and the tendency can very often be simply to thin it down. What I want to do with you this morning, this afternoon, this evening, depending on where you are, is to delve a thick description of spirituality and disability. To begin to dig into what is it substantially that forms our spirituality, and how is it that impact upon our understanding and response to disability. I want to offer you 3 different frameworks for thinking about a thick description of spirituality. First one is the image of God, a theological concept. The second one is a biological concept, which I'll call relational consciousness. And the third one that comes from psychoanalysis, which looks at the significance of meaning for human beings and for spirituality. And these 3 frameworks will help us just to begin to thicken that up, but they'll also reveal some things really important in relation to how we understand disability and how we respond to it. So spirituality and the image of God. When we look historically at the image of God, it's a confused argument, a confused discussion. down through the history of the church, the image of God, that which is within us that somehow represents or images or mirrors God, has been discussed, debated, and really argued over for many years. But one way of thinking about it or noticing certain things that I think is helpful, comes from Karl Barth. Karl Barth points out that each interpreter down through history provides an account of the Imago Dei content to the concept solely from the anthropology and theology of their own age. In other words, the way we think about the image of God is deeply implicated by the culture within which we exist. So Ambrose, the culture there, very much resonated with the idea of the soul as the image of God. For Athanasius, relationality in the light of the doctrine of the Trinity. Augustine, under the influence of Trinitarian dogma, sees the image as a triune factor, the soul, memoria, intellectual, amor. Reformers began to move into the head and begin to equate the image of God with human rationality. And with the Enlightenment, that's made even more strong, that somehow what we image in God is a rationality. That obviously makes it highly problematic for people with intellectual disabilities or people with dementia, who, according to such definitions, either haven't grown into the image of God or somehow have grown out of it. So it's problematic. But Barth says this: one could indeed discuss which of these and similar explanations of the term is the most beautiful or the most deep or the most serious. One cannot, however, discuss which of them is the correct interpretation of Genesis 1:26. In other words, they're very interesting, but they are not definitive. And that's really important for when we're thinking about a Christian spirituality, a theology of the image of God, and we're thinking about that, how it relates to disability. Because the image of God is such an important way of thinking about human beings. To be made in God's image means that somehow you represent God in God's creation. Somehow you image something of God in there. There's a beautiful picture here of the Last Supper, and each person, all the disciples and Jesus, people who live with Down syndrome. It's a very powerful image, because when we think about the image of God, we think of the image of God now, not in the future, not in the eschatological scheme of things, but now. So when we look at the people who live with Down syndrome, we see the image now. And one of the beautiful things about the image of God is it's diverse. It kind of mirrors the diversity of the Trinity in that sense. And Paul talks about the body of Christ, that place where Christ is. He says, Jesus is the image of God, and the body of Christ is the place where we see, feel, live out that image. And the thing that marks the body of Christ is not homogeneity, but diversity. The Trinity is diverse. The body of Christ is diverse. The image of God is diverse. It's only when we recognize all the different aspects of the image of God as it's revealed in all of the different bodily and psychological conditions that we go through that we begin to understand what it means to be in God's image. So rather than trying to confine it to a human capacity, actually it's being human. It's being human together. It's together that we live into the image of God. So the image of God is always coming to us as we discover more diversity, as we learn and come closer to people who sometimes seem different from ourselves. But it's only as we engage with that difference that we begin to understand what the image of God is. So when we look at one another, we see the image in the other. And when we see the image in the other, we respect the other. The second framework that I want us to think about relates to Viktor Frankl's understanding of the human person. Viktor Frankl was a psychoanalyst who, during the last World War, was arrested as a Jewish person, and he and his family were taken to a concentration camp. The last thing that he saw of his family was when they went into the camp, his family went to the right and he went to the left, and he never saw them again. Now, before he had gone into the camp, he'd been working on this theory that the primary motivation for human behavior and for human beings is a search for meaning. So he wasn't happy with the way that Freud had played things out, that only sex and aggression and anxiety was the thing that drove human beings. Franco said, no, it's meaning that drives things. And of course, whenever he went into the camp, his manuscripts were taken from him and destroyed. But he used his experience there to continue to think about his theory. And he noticed that if someone was able to find meaning, even in the most horrendous of circumstances, they could survive. If they didn't find meaning, then they would die. So sometimes people would just turn their face to the wall and die psychologically, sometimes physically. But those who found hope were able to survive even the horrors of the concentration camp. And when he came out, he developed this into what's known as logotherapy, that if a human being can find enough meaning, they can cope with the most difficult of circumstances. And if any of you have worked in end-of-life care, you'll see that people who are profoundly ill can very often hold on if they have something to focus on. If they have a wedding to go to, if they have some celebration or something like that, they can hold on until that happens, and then they'll let themselves go. So meaning is profoundly important. Now, at a thin level, meaning simply means, well, let's find something to make sense of life. So I might find meaning in stamp collecting, or I might find meaning in cycling, or whatever these things. These things are important, but they're thin. So I want us just to think a little bit more about how we might think thickly about meaning. One of the areas I'm very interested in is this area of mental health. And I've done a lot of work recently on the experience of profound and serious mental health challenges. And one of the things that came out of that was the significance of medication. You know, at one level, medication is, well, it's a facility, and then you're fixed. But actually, when you think about medication in the context of a thick meaning, it becomes extraordinarily interesting. A number of years ago, back in the 70s, this book came out. And so the language is a bit questionable, but the study itself is fascinating. Relocating Madness, by two psychologists, Peter Barham and Robert Hayward. And they did a study with 40 people who live with schizophrenia. And they followed them as they moved from the psychiatric institution into society and began to explore how and why they behaved and lived the way they did. And one of the interesting sections of that book is that they talk about compliance and non-compliance for drug taking. So as some of you might be familiar, there's this phenomenon, it's a phenomenon, but it's a kind of way of describing not taking medications, which is called non-compliance. So somebody will stop taking their medication, won't comply with what the psychiatrist says, and they therefore go back to a state of illness and have to have responses accordingly. So that was an established kind of way of thinking about this idea of non-compliance. But what Barham and Hayward discovered was this. When they talked to these people who were living with schizophrenia, they discovered that the problem wasn't non-compliance. Yes, people didn't take their medication, but the meaning for not taking their medication was quite different from the way that, in this case, the psychiatrists assumed it to be. The reason they didn't take medication was because, in inverted commas, mental patients don't take medication. So therefore, I don't want to have that identity. I have a new identity. I'm a citizen. I no longer live in the hospital. I now have to find my identity in the midst of this. And part of that identity finding is to put that part of my life to one side and to live the same way as everybody else does. And so what looks like non-compliance is actually a profound statement of personhood and a quest to find yourself in a very difficult environment. So the search for meaning at spiritual level, who am I? Where do I come from? Where am I going to and why? Was answered to them in quite particular ways by this act of not taking medication. Another good example of that sense of meaning in the midst of something that's apparently technical as pharmacology comes from Monica Coleman in a wonderful book called Bipolar Faith. She talks about her early days when she was encountering depression, how she fought it and tried various things. And eventually she came to the conclusion she was going to have to take medication. And she said this, she said, I held the green and white rectangle of pills in my hand. It was a simple question that required a tectonic shift in my own understanding of myself. In other words, taking that medication for her changed her identity. She wasn't then somebody who just struggling with deep, deep sadness. Now she had to take medication. Now she was a patient. Now she had a different identity and had to work herself out. She was happy to be taking medication, but she recognized that there was something profound about the way the meaning for her life shifted and changed. It's in that simple act of taking a tablet. So you can see that Frankl's idea of searching for meaning, when we use it as a thick lens to look at thick situations, really reveals some fascinating things. So when we're talking about meaning in the context of spirituality, then we need to have a much broader, much thicker understanding than sometimes we have. So the third theoretical framework I want us to think about is to do with the issue of relationships. The one thread that runs through all definitions of spirituality is this idea of relationality, that somehow we need to be in relationship, and spirituality has to do with being in relationship, maybe with God, maybe with others, maybe with your community, but it's always there. But what do we mean by relationship, and what do we mean by calling relationships spiritual? Well, my good friend and colleague, David Hay, he wrote a book a few years ago about spirituality. Now, David he worked alongside us for a number of years, and he was a biologist. Well, actually, he was a zoologist. But he had this theory that human beings are hardwired for spiritual experience. He says for evolutionary purposes, but he doesn't say that in a reductive sense. He says basically the ear evolves because there's something to hear. The eye evolves because there's something to see. And your sense of spirituality evolves because there's something to relate to beyond yourself. So his hypothesis is that human beings are hardwired for religious and for spiritual experience. And he thinks, he goes through a lot of very interesting scientific data in terms of genetics and sociology and lots of interesting things, but this is the aspect of his thinking I want us to think about. He says, if my hypothesis is correct, then the place where I'll find that is in children. Before they become enculturated, before they become educated, we'll find something about spirituality. So he devised this wonderful piece of qualitative research where he accessed the God images, the religious images, the spiritual kind of images that kids use. If you're interested in this kind of thing, that book, The Spirit of the Child, is fascinating, both methodologically and in his conclusions. And of course, he did find that. He found that children have a sense of awe and wonder, a sense of relationality, a sense of reaching beyond themselves. And he calls this a desire to relate beyond yourself. He describes it as relational consciousness. The desire to reach out to someone beyond yourself, he says, is something that's innate in human beings. But he also points out that the education system that we oftentimes use despiritualizes people. So people have this relational consciousness, this desire to reach out to others and reach out to God ultimately. But the education system says, no, these things are not important. It says maths, science, hard science. These are the most important things. Yes, you can think about ethics, morality, relationships. That's okay, but this is what is important. And so you get this spiritual dissonance in the way that we educate people, children. And then by the time they get into their early teens, they get confused. Now, a lot of the confusion that David says that teenagers have is the push by culture to make you an individual and the inherent desire to be relational. And importantly, he points out that actually individualized culture, as we have in Western societies, is unnatural. He says that's not the way we're intended to be. And one of the reasons why we have so many difficulties, psychological difficulties, is because we're constantly being told we're individuals, and in fact, we're actually always bound to community. So it's a very interesting theory, and this is a perspective on spirituality. So how does all this relate to our thinking about disability? Well, let me give you an example. A couple of years ago, I did a study that was looking at the spiritual lives of Christians who lived with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depression. And I just spent 2 years going around various people using a phenomenological approach, which simply means I put to one side my assumptions about what the diagnosis of schizophrenia should look like and everything that's associated with that, but try to put that to one side and listen to the stories that people gave to me. And when you listen to people's stories, you get a really different perspective on the way that things are, because you put to one side all your prejudices, all your caricatures, and listen, and fascinating things happen. So thinking about both Frankel's framework on meaning and David Hay's idea of relational consciousness, let me give you a short abstract from that study, which is Alan's story. Alan lived with schizophrenia for many years, and he told me about the time when he was diagnosed. Now, we saw with Monica Coleman how that shift in identity happens when you're diagnosed with anything. And he said, for some time, I'd been hearing voices and I'd been getting the sense that people were against me, and I'd been struggling. And my mum said, go to the psychiatrist. So he went to the psychiatrist and he was interviewed and he was assessed. And the psychiatrist said to him, Alan, you have schizophrenia. And Alan said, at that moment, my life ended. He said, I'm never going to have a friend again. I'm never going to have a job. I'm going to be kicked out by everybody. And my whole life is going to come apart. And remember, all that happened is the psychiatrist used that word, described him in that way. And suddenly his whole world fell apart. There was no meaning. There was no purpose. There was no future for him. And he went home, and he jumped on the bus, and he sat down beside a lady who he'd known for quite some time. And he explained this situation. He said, no, the psychiatrist says I've got schizophrenia. And the woman stood up and got off the bus and never spoke to him again. And he was devastated because same for her, she heard this word, everything was over. And so he went home to his mum and said, Mum, this has happened to me. I'm a schizophrenic. My life is over. And his mum said, no, Alan, you have schizophrenia, but I love you and you've got a great future. And he said at that moment, everything changed. Suddenly I realized I was still loved by my mum. I realized that's still possible for me to be loved by something else. And suddenly I have a future. In other words, his relational consciousness was crushed by the diagnosis and the implications of the diagnosis, but his mother's love opened him up again to that relational sphere and gave his life meaning and purpose and hope, which I think is probably the best task that churches can do for anybody who lives with a highly stigmatized condition, is just offer love and friendship. But you can see how these frameworks help us to understand Alan's situation in fresh ways. Likewise, in some of the research we've done on autism, it's been quite fascinating because, again, we think about relationships as central to spirituality, but very often people who live with autism relate differently. And we find that sometimes you can even read about saying that people can't relate at all, but that's a mistake. People relate differently. There's a lot of very interesting research that looks at that whole way in which people manifest their love. I read a fascinating article about a woman the other day who, for some time, had been concerned about the behavior of her husband and also of her children. Eventually, it turned out they had a diagnosis of Asperger's. And so she said, immediately I understood. It wasn't that they weren't relating with me, they were just relating differently. And I realized that I have to express my love, not necessarily in the romantic way that society assumes that relationships should be, but by keeping the house tidy, by making sure that things are in the right place, by making sure that my husband's sandwiches are in the right place at the right time, on the right day. And she says, love, relationships just look different, but they're no less powerful. So when we're talking about relational consciousness, we're not talking about a romantic idea. We're talking about relationships in all of their diversity. In the same way as the image of God is diverse, relationships are diverse, but they're always powerful. Usually for, well, no, sometimes for bad, but hopefully for good. Finally, sorry, I'm clicking in the wrong place here. Finally, I want to just sum up with a few thoughts and to tie in what I want to say in relation to disability. The thinning of our vision, noticing pathogenic communities. First thing I want us to notice is this: the way that many people with disabilities are treated is unnatural. If we have a natural sense of relatedness, if community is our primary biological and spiritual goal, then to alienate people is an unnatural thing to do. And the problem is that we have a pathogenic culture, an individualistic culture that tends to stigmatize and alienate people who are different. But that stigmatization, that alienation, is actually unnatural if we're going to believe what David Hayes says. So take these three examples. Stigma. You know, as some of you might know, stigma comes from the slave trade, the ancient Greek slave trade, where a trader would buy a slave and put a mark on that slave, and then they would be that mark. They would no longer have a name, no longer have a family, no longer be a person, they'd simply be that mark. And that's exactly the way that stigma functions. You can see it in the way that Alan took on that stigma immediately, and his world just shrunk in that way. So stigma destroys meaning. Stigma is a deeply spiritual problem. It shrinks your world, takes away the possibilities. And unless somebody can rescue you, that could be your life. Stuck in that meaningless place where your diagnosis, where your formal description just takes away everything. Secondly, exclusion and the obliteration of relational consciousness. If we find ourselves excluding people with disabilities from communities for whatever reason, and I mean theological exclusion as well as physical exclusion, then again, we're being functioning not only unnatural in this case, but we're actually functioning in an atheological, unspiritual way. We're doing the exact opposite of what the image of God calls us to do, which is to respect diversity, to recognize the image of God in each one of us, and to come together in order that we can discover who we are, who God is. Ultimately, we can discover who we are, where we come from, where we're going to, and why. And of course, underlying that is that big divine question of who we are. And finally, or penultimately, prejudice in the image of God, the same thing. People living with disabilities very often find themselves in an apartheid-like situation where they're kind of part of things, but not part of things. They're kind of together, but not together. That's just simply the exact opposite of the way that Christian spirituality is. To be prejudiced in that way towards anyone, be that disability, race, gender, whatever it is to go against that which God has given to us in the image of God. To be prejudiced is to destroy your relational consciousness, to refuse to relate to people who very much want to relate. So prejudice destroys meaning. So if we take spirituality seriously and think about it thickly, if there is such a word, it reveals some profound and uncomfortable truths. That our society is pathogenic, that the way that we think culturally very often is just unnatural, and that we need to shift and change and take spirituality seriously if we're going to have the kind of community within which each one of us has a space and a place and a voice, and the image can be seen in us. So I just want to conclude with a a little abstract from the study that I talked to you about. And it's an abstract by a woman called Alice who lives with schizophrenia. And she's just talking to me about community relationships. I'll read this to you. She says, when I was in hospital, I met some really interesting people. I met Jesus at one point. He's a 50-year-old moldy man from London. Being Jesus seems to be a common mental health issue. It's really interesting. But yeah, he was Jesus or an Old Testament prophet. It depended on the day. But I met a guy in his 60s who thought I was his mum. And I met a whole lot of interesting people. I met a lady who thought her face was falling off and all that kind of stuff. It's so fascinating what people's brains can do to them. It's just, and I think for all of us, because we were all in it together, there's a sense of community that is definitely, I find I've missed a lot. And we're the nuttiest community out there. And we used to just sit around in the circle and smoke up a storm and swear and drink and whatever. But we understood that there was no need to explain if you start talking to a corner. Everyone would just go, ah, yes, she's off her meds. No one would go, would condemn us. There was real sense of family. And I haven't found that again. And I see that's a real challenge. This woman can find community in this strange place, a place where she's accepted, where she has friends, where they have fun together. And yet when it comes to the community of the friends of Jesus, she can't find a space. And I think we all need to think about that. Why can't she find a space? Why is it that we want to quench or seem to quench our relational consciousness? Why is it that we find it so difficult to incorporate her and discover what she can bring to our communities? Why does she not be able to find that in the kind of spaces that all of us inhabit? So just finally, spirituality and disability. So it's a political journey, and I mean political with a small p in the sense of the way in which we organize ourselves, organize our communities. But I also mean political with a large P, because if there's something wrong with our society, then we need to think about what that means for politics and all of its different dimensions. So it's a political journey towards God, in whose image all of us are made, filled with relationships, because we all have this relational consciousness, as we search for meaning in a thick sense, and we search for love, which we've already found, because love's already found us. So I hope that's helpful, and I hope that that's been in line with the things that that you hope to do. I'm happy to, if I can get out of this, share. I'm happy to answer any questions that might be around.
John, thank you. Thank you very much. I just wanted to give some recommendations to those who want to ask questions or comments. So you're welcome to place the comments and questions in the chat at any time for participants to consider and respond to. However, if you wish to participate in the Q&A discussion with John, please raise your virtual hand. If you are joining via telephone, you can raise and lower your virtual hand by dialing *9. When called upon, you may either send your question via the chat box or unmute yourself to ask your question, whichever makes the discussion more welcoming and accessible to you.
I think I see Herb's hand.
John, thank you so much. My coffee's upstairs, and I'd like to get that cup of coffee, but I was glued to the screen, and so thank you so much. One part that just resonated with me, I've heard you speak before. I live in Toronto, Canada. The idea that people with disabilities, they're part of things, but not really part of things. And I think of my university experience when I was just in college, where on one hand I was part of things, but in my heart of hearts I really wasn't. And I think in similar ways, some of the friends that I know, with disabilities. They haven't expressed that, but I can see that. They're part of things, but not really. And I think we have to do everything we can to make sure that at the level of their abilities, that they truly feel that they are part of things. Just wanted to make that comment. Thank you.
It's a good point here, and I think
keep up your
the idea of being part of things and not part of things doesn't just apply to people living with disability. It applies to us all in different ways.
All of us. Yeah.
There's lots of us that feel that way. I mean, the way I think about that is in that tension between inclusion and belonging. And I see Eric Carter's here. Eric's done a lot of really good work on belonging. The way in which I think about so to be included, you just need to be in the room, right? So you have to fulfill the law, and you have to allow people to get the space in the room, but you don't have to do anything to them. You don't have to love people. You don't have to relate to them. And again, I say this is for everybody. But for somebody to belong, they need to have a space that's their own, right? So you need to miss them. You have to look for them when they're not there. You have to be friends with them in a genuine sort of way. And I think sometimes we're quite good at inclusion, but actually when it comes to belonging, and creating spaces of belonging for everybody, that we kind of fall down. So it can look as if we're doing things, but actually in reality we're not. So your point is absolutely pertinent.
Thank you.
Who do I see? Victoria.
John Swinton called my name.
That's right. I'll have to charge you for it.
I'll pay it. Doesn't matter. Send me the bill. Say it again. So, I work with churches all around the United States, and now with Friendship Ministries, I'm working with churches all over the place as they contact us. And I think about the question that I run across so often is, where are there people with disabilities in leadership in the faith community? And so I think about some of the studies that you shared in your framework, and I think, how do we get there? How do we get to the point that belonging means that there are people in leadership and role models in ministry who have disabilities? What do you see in that realm? If I can ask it that way, are you working with people who have disabilities who are now in ministry? Like, are some of the people that you've been studying with and learning from in ministry leadership roles?
Yeah, but there are blockages. I mean, there's significant blockages. And I think certainly in the UK, the churches are becoming more aware of it. So my own church, which is the Church of Scotland, is certainly aware of it. And we just formed the new disability task force to look at that. And one of the things we will look at is ministerial training, and why there are first of all, why there are so few people training at all. But secondly, why there are so few people with disabilities. So it's there, but it needs to be developed. And I know the Church of England's had the same difficulties we all have. But positively, I think it's on people's horizons. So I think the key is drawing people's attention and raising people's consciousness so that we can begin to talk about it. And I think that's starting to happen. So I'm reasonably optimistic that people are getting it on the horizon. As to whether we can solve the problem, and I think it is a problem, that's another question, but it's fundamentally important. Because, not least because if you think about it, God uses people with disabilities at key points in the story of our salvation. Moses with his stutter, Paul with his bad back, all these things. So it's there in the tradition. We just need to dig it out and put it in a different space. Thank you, Victoria. David.
Good morning, John. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good, thank you. I'm actually working on a project. I'm a chaplain in a hospital, a chaplain resident, in fact, in a local hospital here. And I'm trying to develop a spiritual assessment model for persons with disabilities. So I appreciated your definition, and in particular, how can we influence the institutional definition that hospitals have for spirituality that by definition excludes people with disabilities?
Yeah. It's very difficult because, you've got a different health service or a way of delivering healthcare from here. But the system we have here is free healthcare free to everybody at the point of delivery. So there's no charge for healthcare. But because of that, and because it's such a diversity of group of people that are involved, there's not a lot of room for specific spirituality, which was pushing into. So if you're a chaplain, it's actually very difficult for you to talk about the specifics of Christianity in the midst of your spirituality. So you have that institutional spirituality. Now, within that institutional spirituality, because healthcare is designed for people when they're unwell, I mean, that's the reason it exists, to solve problems and to get people better. Disability has a particular meaning there. So it's quite difficult to create an understanding of disability in a hospital context, because the very reason the hospital there is to fix people. And so the first port of call when people are defining disability is, oh, there must be something wrong. So to introduce that revised understanding that that's not necessarily the case and that there are other ways of thinking about it can be difficult within a healthcare system because of that. I imagine that's at least part of the thing that you're experiencing yourself.
Thank you, John.
Okay, Elizabeth.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. Super cool to see that. So I'm an autistic divinity student who is trying to provide these spaces of access, but working on a much smaller scale, right? So working in my small university, working in my tiny Anglican church, right? Like all these spaces, what do you see as, how do you find like we in these spaces of this high thought, right? This really big focus on theory and idea can then bring it down into these practical levels in these small dioceses? What are some things that you think we can do as disability advocates to really bring in people with disabilities, make them feel included?
Well, this is going to sound like a cop-out, but rather, we have a new Centre for Autism and Christian Theology at Aberdeen University, and there's two guys there who are running it, Grant McCaskill, who's a professor in New Testament, and Leon Van Omen, who teaches in practical theology, and that's exactly what the centre exists for. So rather than me giving you two superficial answers, I can put you in touch with them and they can share the materials and they can share the thinking. You could actually become a part of that centre if you wanted to have some dialogue partners around that. So I think, drop me an email if you like, and I'll put you in touch with them, and then they can talk more sense than I would in a 30-second soundbite.
No, that's awesome. Thank you so much. Yes, absolutely.
Precious.
Hi, John. Thanks for the presentation. So my question is, I just wanted to get your view. So as a Christian, I wonder what it would look like to have a framework for spiritual care provision that meets the spiritual needs of people with disability without it being restricted to one religious framework.
What would it look like?
Yeah, so have you had any experience or encounter or research on that or anything?
Yeah, well, to be honest with you, I think you'd probably discover that university chaplains, hospital chaplains would have ways of negotiating that. My sense is that in the UK, as far as I know, there's no forum that actually does that. But that may be a good idea to think about having one, because one of the nice things about the idea of the image of God is it's a hospitable concept, right? So it means that you can enter into dialogue with a variety of different perspectives without having to lose your own perspective. You see what I mean? So I don't know whether, to my knowledge, there's nowhere that does that. So I can't give you an example. But it's definitely something that's worth thinking about. How can we negotiate the complexities of interreligious conversation with a focus around disability? And it may be that actually a focus around disability is a nice space to inhabit, because it's a place where there probably isn't a lot of the conflict that there is in other ways. So it could actually be quite a peacemaking space. But I'm not familiar with any.
Okay, thank you.
But if you discover some, let me know, because I'm curious.
Yeah, I'm actually it's something I'm working on, because my thesis was on spirituality and people with disabilities and their quality of life, but it was in a Christian context.
Okay.
Non-Christian context.
No, I'd be interested. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Lynn.
Yes, thank you. That was eye-opening in many, many ways. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about people with chronic illness disabilities, many of whom are confined to their homes or to their beds and find it very, very difficult to find community, or don't have the energy maybe for more than a few moments with people and that sort of thing. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. It's interesting because my mum, just now, she's 97, and she's not been well recently, and she's been confined to her bed for the past month or so. But she has had a stream of visitors at her door. So people have, well, once COVID let go of us all, so people are constantly visiting her. So she's constantly connected with her friends, constantly connected with her church. And so that process of visiting actually means that she has a physical connection with the world, even though she never leaves a particular room. Now, I recognize that many, maybe most elderly people don't have that. People who have particular conditions that keep them housebound don't necessarily have that. But the power of visitation, it seems to me, is the most important thing there. If you're a pastor in a congregation or a congregation, then to be able to notice people, to be able to facilitate visiting in that sense, a simple gift of friendship begins to reconnect you with that community. And it kind of takes you back to that idea of belonging, because the problem, part of the problem you're highlighting is a lot of people don't belong to anywhere. So they don't really get picked up, or they don't really find that these relational networks are still in place, which is a problem if you're naturally relational, but at the same time, you're not getting that. So I think it's structured visiting and having central people within your congregation who are keeping an eye on people. So if you like, people who are welcomers, or people who have a deep understanding of what belonging means and are prepared to look for people in that way. So refocusing your pastoral efforts on those who are oftentimes forgotten would be at least the beginning point for the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think that's the last question as far as I can see, Frank.
There's a question in the chat that whether the framework which you have provided applies in the same way to people with physical disabilities.
It applies to everybody. Yeah, I mean, it's basically these three frameworks are just part of what we need as human beings to live well and to live life in all its fullness in the way that Jesus talks about. So it applies to people with disabilities, without disabilities, physical, psychological, and whatever.
I was going to ask you, since you mentioned Viktor Frankl, has his work held up over the decades, as far as you know?
Yeah, well, he's still, yes, but the short answer is yes. And there's actually some there's some very innovative uses of his work that's going on. So for example, there's a consultant psychiatrist who works in end-of-life care at Sloan Kettering University, who's done some fascinating work bringing Viktor Frankl's way of thinking into end-of-life groups. So what he's doing there is people will come to him say at the end of their lives and say, well, my life is meaningful. I'm meaningless. I'm a burden. I just want to die. And so rather than thinking about physician-assisted suicide, he created meaning-centered groups where people got together in that last part of their life and discussed issues around spirituality broadly defined. And at the end of that process, they discovered that the questions of, I want to take my own life, or I don't want to live like this, disappeared because people discovered that actually they could find meaning even in these really, really difficult circumstances. So yeah, he's still alive and well in people's thinking.
I'm glad to hear that. Unless there's another question out there, raise your hand or what have you. And but I'm not seeing any. Well, John, thank you very much for a very engaging presentation. And I found it personally very enlightening and helpful. So thank you.
Thank you.
So now we have a break until 9:30 Eastern time or New York time. And so you're welcome to stay put or just turn off your video and turn on your mute. And